Currently out here in the Pacific Northwest, or the Cascadian bioregion, we're currently experiencing an ongoing atmospheric river, meaning that a cuss ton of moisture is falling as rain, leading to all sorts of flooding and erosion, especially on the west side of the mountains in Washington, Oregon, and parts of BC, that threatens infrastructure, housing, and has really heavy impacts on many people's lives. You may have also noticed that this seems to be a growing trend, all these fall and early winter floods that seem to happen every year, and these are a combination of three compounding factors that I think would be a really good thing to address here, with the third one being perhaps the biggest and most daunting of all. So stick around to learn about these floods and how we can do better to create a better future for all of us here. Okay, so firstly, we need to acknowledge the fact that flooding of rivers to some extent is a completely natural thing, and rivers have inherently designed features to mitigate this, which we know as floodplains. So river floodplains are naturally occurring areas within the riparian zone of a river that are dry most of the year, but do flood seasonally when high flows push the boundary of the river outside of the main stream channel, flowing into these often wide, meandering channels through the surrounding landscape. Now, floodplains play a really important part of these ecosystems by providing eddies and slower moving backwaters that fish and other critters use to escape the high velocity of the main stem of the river during these floods, to seasonally wetting swamps and marshy areas removed from the main stem of the river, to inundating vegetation with different nutrients and sediments that they require to grow, all of whom have adapted to live within this seasonal flooding. Yet because these floodplains are often really wide, flat, sprawling areas nearby easy to access water sources, they're also the primary areas that us humans have settled and developed on. So a majority of our highways, roads, houses, and towns are actually placed within these natural floodplains, and thus are very prone to seasonal flooding. We chose to put our stuff here, and that means that we also need to take responsibility for that. Now, many townships will construct elaborate dikes, riprap systems, or strategically place boulder guards to try to control the river, to keep it in its path and prevent its floodwaters from rising into developments. Yet this strategy, ironically, often ends up creating more harm than good. By restricting the main stem of the river through these means, we end up pinching or constricting the flow of the river, which creates a stronger, more turbulent flow with higher velocity, as all that water that would normally spread out is forced through this tight gap, creating a fire hose effect that ends up eroding exposed banks far more rapidly, while also scouring a deeper river channel. Not only does this create less complex rivers with far less biodiversity and no habitat for fish or anything to live in there, but as that channel deepens, it can end up dropping the water table in the area, and with less water backed up and stored throughout the rest of the watershed, we end up with areas that are typically drier, hotter, and more prone to different seasonal threats like wildfire. So watersheds are comprised of different biotic and abiotic elements that have evolved together to store and slow the flow of water through them, which creates healthy, complex ecosystems. But in our effort to control nature and force the river to do what we want, we end up speeding up that flow of water to get it out of our communities as fast as possible, which results in bigger issues in the long run. So instead of restricting our river systems and trying to enforce our will upon them, we need to learn to live alongside and embrace their chaotic nature if we're choosing to live within a floodplain. Now, speaking of biotic factors within a watershed, this brings me to my second point. Forests along hillsides and in riparian areas of a watershed have evolved over millennia to perform all sorts of complex ecological functions, with roots that hold soils together, slow and control the flow of water through these ecosystems, and store it to mitigate drought and wildfire. These complex ecological functions are performed by biological complexity, with many different species of plants and trees at many different ages, with many different various structural components all working together. However, as numerous studies have shown for decades, when we clear-cut these forests and reduce their complexity by making them all the same species or the same age of trees, we lose those ecological functions, and hydrology, or the way that water flows through these ecosystems, is often one of the largest aspects impacted. When we clear-cut hillsides and reduce forest complexity, we lose the variety of roots holding soils together and slowing the flow of water, which ends up creating really flashy systems that aren't able to handle heavy rains, and thus they flood very quickly. This influx of water also leads to increase in soil loss and erosion, which further destabilizes banks and contributes to landslides, which threatens communities and takes very long time to revegetate and recover. There's a reason so many of the areas dealing with flooding right now are downstream from ongoing or historic industrial logging, and that's because the clear-cut model that industrial logging requires to turn a profit for their shareholders directly and irreparably destroys forest ecosystems and the long-term ecological function they serve, thereby making these watersheds more volatile and prone to flashy floods. And then thirdly and finally, one of the biggest considerations we need to have regarding these floods is the fact that we are witnessing rapid, large-scale changes in hydrological regimes as a result of anthropogenic climate change. Those are a lot of big words, but what's it mean? So let me break it down. Every river has a very unique flow pattern of high and low flows over the course of the year, which is determined by where its water comes from, as each watershed has developed over the past several thousand years. Each river system is a mix of factors, but broadly speaking, in the mountainous coastal regions of Cascadia, most rivers here are nival in origin, or snowpack dominated, with peak flows usually occurring in the spring as snow in the mountains melts and feeds these rivers. However, our winters in this part of the world are rapidly becoming warmer and wetter, which means that these nival systems are becoming more pluvial or rain dependent, with peak flows typically in the fall and winter as warmer rainstorms melt what little snow exists in the mountains, which quickly floods downstream regions as we're currently witnessing. In a similar way, more interior glacially dependent systems with peak flows in the late summer when glaciers start to melt are rapidly becoming more nival and even pluvial in origin very quickly, and all of this has huge implications for these watersheds. Species of salmon who use these rivers to spawn and thrive in are uniquely adapted to the flow patterns of their native rivers, and when we see heavy flooding at times when they aren't expecting it, it can destroy their redds, habitat features, or sweep out and kill adults and juvenile fish altogether, which can have catastrophic impacts on their already struggling populations. Changes in hydrological regimes can flood forests when they aren't expecting it, drowning saplings and young plants, as well as the various critters who call these places home, while simultaneously drying them out when they really need the moisture, such as during peak summer heat when fire risk is at its greatest. In short, river flow patterns are changing very quickly at rates that the species who rely on them can't necessarily adapt, which is leading to much bigger wide-scale problems and ecological collapse as a result of man-made climate change from us burning fossil fuels and altering the chemical composition of our atmosphere on a global scale. So yes, we are experiencing relatively normal early winter flooding. However, these floods are happening more frequently and on larger scale than they would have historically as a result of compounding factors. Us humans have radically altered the climate and created stronger, wetter, warmer winter storms, and this, combined with our large-scale terrestrial modifications from clearcut logging to engineered dams, dikes, and retaining walls, is creating very large and extreme floods for this time of year. These floods are increasingly more expensive and damaging because we have also disproportionately developed our infrastructure in the floodplains of major river systems, or the very places that develop naturally to mitigate these types of flooding events. Despite knowing how floodplains function, municipalities and private landowners spend millions of dollars on short-term infrastructure developments that seek to maintain property values instead of adequately dealing with the problems of living in a floodplain, ultimately just passing the buck on to future generations to deal with. Despite knowing very well the impacts of clear-cut logging on hydrological processes of these watersheds, logging companies and the politicians they prop up continue to clear-cut log and destroy our ecosystems in order to maximize short-term profits to their shareholders while continuing to take zero accountability or responsibility for the lands and communities that they rely on. Despite decades of research into the root causes and impacts of anthropogenic climate change, oil and gas industries continue to fuel disinformation and fund politicians who push agendas of war and division for the sake of maintaining control of the energy sector to keep us all dependent on fossil fuels, despite the obvious and irreversible damage it is causing to the world that we all live amongst. Yes, these floods are intense and tragic and horrific, and many people will be severely impacted by these events, but these tragedies are also completely our doing. No matter how much we try to ignore it, the reality is that we are intimately and intricately interconnected to and interdependent on everything in this world. And if we want to create a different, better future for tomorrow, then we need to start acting differently today, and that begins with thinking differently about what the cuss we're doing to these ecosystems in the first place.